Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all the alumni of the Institute of Directors who have attended various programs conducted by IOD Bangalore, especially the Masterclass for Directors. I am Arun Balakrishnan, Chairman of the Bangalore chapter of IOD. A hearty welcome to all of you. Most of you, I am sure, would be in the work at home mode as the rules of engagement are just changing. We would have loved to have you all, your personal presence for this seminar, but given the constraint, we felt the webinar format is the best alternative. Since we are not sure when we can all meet in such large numbers, we may attempt a few more such seminars during this calendar year. For all of us, it was a tough challenge being locked down in our homes and watching the TV anchor, counting the increasing number infected by the deadly coronavirus and the number who succumbed to the disease. For some of us, our careers and incomes have been affected quite seriously. For the guest workers, who we call the migrants, the choice was even worse. The economy has also taken a beating and the country's GDP is obviously going downhill. That's a no-brainer, I know, as it's simple mathematics that if you lock up the country for more than 2 months, the GDP has nowhere else to go other than down. We at IOD have been discussing this for a while, and we thought of getting an expert view on the subject. Dr. Vinod Vyaslu, who has spoken to IOD alumni often before, has kindly agreed to tell us his views on the economic impact of the lockdown on the country. For those of you who may not know Dr. Vyaslu too well, a few words of introduction. He did his master's in economics from the Delhi School of Economics and has a PhD from the School of Business Administration from the University of Florida. He has taught in the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, XLRI Jamshedpur. He was director of the Institute of Public Enterprise, Hyderabad, and held the RBI chair in the Institute for Social and Economic Change. He also had a stint as economic advisor for small-scale industries in the National Small-Scale Industries Corporation, Delhi. He was also director of the Center for Budget and Policy Studies in Bangalore. Until recently, he was professor and vice dean at Jindal School of Government and Policy, and he now lives in Bangalore. Before I hand over to Dr. Vyaslu, a few housekeeping items. Please desist from personal chat while the talk is going on, as it disturbs the speaker as well as the audience. You may put your questions in the chat and Dr. Vyaslu will answer them, or most of them, within the time allocated. This program will close at 12:30. I would also suggest that until such time you have a question to ask, you may please shut off your video, because that will give us better bandwidth and our audio will be much clearer and it will be easier to listen to Dr. Vyaslu. Dr. Vyaslu will be starting shortly. He will be starting with the base of January 2020, because that is where the real decline in the, of course, the real decline in the economy had started a little earlier, but the comparative base for a talk on the lockdown would ideally be January. And we had requested Dr. Vyaslu to look at January as a starting point for his statistic comparison of where we are and where we are going. Okay. As we go along, my colleague Brigadier Rajiv Kapoor will be coordinating the program till its conclusion. Okay. Now, may I request Dr. Vyaslu to start his talk? Over to Dr. Vyaslu.
Thank you very much, Arun. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I've got a message that the bandwidth is low, so I'll go off video and continue. I accept the ground rules that you've given, quite happy with them. Questions can be put in the chat box, and whenever possible, I will answer them. I'll go off video now. This is a diff.
Vinod sir, good afternoon. Sir, Vinod sir, good morning. I'm the technical head. Sir, I would request, please do not close your window. People are watching you.
Okay, I'll open it up. This fine?
Yeah, good to go, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go then. This is a rather difficult topic to discuss, mainly because Post-lockdown, all of us are not in the best frame of mind. Nobody reacts very well when restrictions are imposed or put on them, although very often it's for our own good. So what I'm going to try and do is follow the lead given by Arun, use January as a starting point. Since this discussion is on the economic impact of lockdown, it would be very useful to look at the state of the economy around January. And that is the comparison point as to what happened later. Furthermore, the lockdown itself happened because of this phenomenon called COVID. Some have called it a black swan event. That means something totally unknown which has hit us. Another metaphor for that is gray rhino, which is that it's a phenomenon that could be predicted. There were indications of it, but for some reason we ignored it. Whatever the case is, having described the start, we knew about COVID at that point in time, lockdown, and then go on to the question of impacts. Okay. I'm not going to present a lot of statistics for two reasons. One is I'm not adept at this medium. It become very difficult for me to project slides showing tables and switch screens and so on. That's the truth. There's also another reason, and that is that we have used to it with charts in the last. So I think it might be more useful if we just go back to some of the basics and discuss the matter from there. Okay, what was the economy like in January 2020? The economy was declining. In other words, we'd had a period of high growth starting with the reforms of 1991. The reform basically consisted of moving in a direction of a market-friendly economy, where the government reduced its role as an actor in the economy and tried to become more of a facilitator and regulator. All governments since then have followed this. What each government has done is they tweaked the economy and the rules and laws for the situation of the time. Actually, we are very lucky that for such a long period of time, we have functioned with one reasonable philosophy, and the results have shown in the form of high rates of growth. It's important to remember this because up to 1950, for the 50 years before that, the rate of growth was about 0.5% of GDP. From 1950 to about 1970, 75, we had the famous Hindu rate of growth, 3.5%. You'll see it's a jump. Freedom did make a difference. And then from 80, it went up a little bit, but from 91 onwards, we talk of 6% as a low rate. And the trend rate of growth, if you exclude the last few years, has been around 6.5. So compared to that, if you look at January, the rates had considerably come down. The reasons are multiple, some internal, some external. The external ones have to do with the fact that the Chinese economy was slowing down for their own reasons. They were contracting. Then the Trump-China dispute came in with tariffs and things so that the free trade regime got jolted. These are the main external elements following upon the 2008 financial crash when the world experienced a huge slowdown. Internal issues, yes, I think two big ones which everybody accepts now, the demonetization of 2016, the hurried implementation of the GST, and these two led to a slowdown, largely by through the implementation side, the increased cost of compliance, the failure of the IT backbone in some cases. You want website freezes or crashes, all kinds of things started happening. So it was slowing down, and measures were expected for a revival. Around September or October last year, the government responded by lowering tax rates, corporate tax rates, and it followed the general philosophy of government, not just in India, but in many other countries, which runs as follows: that if you lower tax rates, there is more money in the hands of businesses in particular, but also individuals. And this means there will be higher rates of investment. And higher rates of investment translate to higher rates of growth. And higher rates of growth will mean higher revenues even at a lower rate. And these revenues can then be used for various responsibilities of government, welfare measures, whatever the government of the day thought was important. If we look at that, the tax reductions of late last year may or may not have had an effect, but the trends were that things are not going well. So that is the background in which we have to look at what happened. What happened after 19? The first case that I'm aware of was sometime in the middle of January in Kerala. And it was somebody who came in from abroad by flight, and he infected others, and that's how it began to spread. I've not seen too much of what happened in January, but in February, this was repeated in other airports. So the main area of infection, the transmission point from abroad, seemed to be the international airports. So then the governments put in, particularly Kerala had an efficient system of contacting the people, tracing their contacts, isolating them. But that is, Kerala had an experience, had investigated, dealt with a system of zoning where the hotspots were red zones and attention was focused on them. Well, by now, it looks like Kerala has managed to deal with this. There were other places also with a reasonably good record. We read about the Bhilwara model in Rajasthan, which also was based upon a lockdown, an effective lockdown. What did we know of COVID at this point in time? The numbers when we started the lockdown were less than 200. In a country where we have had lots of epidemics before, where there are lots of starvation deaths, malnutrition, all malaria, TB, it wasn't something that would set off alarm bells. I wouldn't blame the government for not getting very worried at that particular point in time. What we did know was that it was highly infectious. And therefore, some kind of care had to be taken to limit the infection rate. News from abroad came in. We heard about Wuhan in China and how Wuhan was locked down. The next part was Italy, Lombardy, again a complete lockdown. And by this time, I think a sense of panic began to set in. Policy, blame them because at that point, there were probably less than 100 cases. But by the time March came around and these numbers, the experience from abroad was scary. It's not that they knew very much better. We all know that the European countries have good health systems. And if they were panicking, we read in reports, senior citizens, some kind of triage because their chances of survival were less compared to young people. About a shortage of ICUs, ventilators. So there was a bit of a panic. And I think we reacted to that particular panic when first we had the Janta curfew, followed by a complete lockdown. The interesting feature about our lockdown is that it was absolute, complete punitive. The whole country was locked down, although at that point in time, with less than 200 cases, confined to urban areas, large urban conglomerations. To me, it seems a bit of an overreaction. Even in China, they only locked down Wuhan, not the whole of China. But whatever it is, there was this lockdown, but the lockdown came with 4 hours notice. The advice we were given was stay where you are. Now, this makes things somewhat difficult. If you look at other countries, they all gave notice. Yes, New Zealand is a small country, but they gave 4 days notice so that people could go to their homes, to places where they would be comfortable, and they could lay down provisions, etc., to deal with the lockdown. We had no such luck. However, for urban areas, I think the government did a fairly good job. After the initial disruption of the first few days, for people like us, supplies of groceries, milk, newspapers, all this sorted out. There was no great difficulty. What took some people by surprise, certainly the government by surprise, was that shortly after the lockdown, we had this phenomenon of large number of poor laborers working in largely the southern and western states who had nowhere to go. They had no homes. Lockdown, stay at home really meant nothing for them. They lived in horrible conditions. The social distancing was impossible. So I think trains were not running, buses were not running. For them, the logical thing seemed to be to try to get home anyhow. And the country was suddenly woke up to this phenomenon of thousands of people on the highways desperately walking home. Now, this is a bit of a blot on our country because it brought out all kinds of devastation suffered by one class of people. We had both good and bad experiences. There were a lot of people who responded. I know of a lot of youngsters who went out of their way to try and arrange food and supplies for such people across India. But there were also a whole lot of other people who simply sort of locked themselves up at home and say, not my problem. This problem has not yet got fully mitigated. The numbers are enormous, and while many of us are okay in the thing, when you see millions of people in such distress, then the overall social situation is not a good one. Now, I'm frankly surprised that the government was caught napping by this problem. The Economic Survey of 2017 has an extensive discussion of the problem of internal migration. And if I remember right, it puts a figure about 100 million of people internal migration. Migration is not a good word. It is usually used when you go from one country to another. A lot of the IT people in California are migrants to America. I myself a migrant to Bangalore. I grew born in Andhra, studied in Delhi, and came here for a job. Nobody calls me a migrant. The use of the word sets up an us and them kind of situation, which makes it easy for us to say it's not a problem. Unfortunately, I don't know why the government was caught napping. Its own data showed that there was a large number of migrants. It showed the directions of migration. UP, Bihar, Odisha, Chhattisgarh were the states from which these workers went outside. Part of this migration itself was a result of the growth that came about as a result of the liberalized economic policies. Because as growth takes place, it means more economic activities are taking place. There's a demand for labor in those areas where these economic activities are taking place, where investments are taking place. And therefore, people who had no options where they were tried to go and make a living. Now, what can we say about this particular situation that came out? So in sum total, when we look at it, what has this particular lockdown achieved in terms of the stated goal of eliminating COVID? That's how it started. So that if we stayed at home like this, the infection rate is about 2 weeks. And if we are at home for 4 or 6 weeks, that cycle is stopped. And if we break contact through lockdown, through isolation, that will break the chain of transmission and beat the disease. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have happened. Today, if you look at it, there are almost 2.5 lakh cases across the country, largely concentrated in urban areas. But with the move of these laborers to their home states, one can expect that there will be a surge in these states, in UP, in Bihar, etc., which unfortunately also have the weaker public health systems in the country. Just one second. What about the rest of the economy? Supply chains got disrupted. Industries, well, if you cannot produce, then as Arun said, the only way the economy can go is down. Large industries shut. Small industries have been destroyed. There's no immediate hope that they can come back. So based upon the bad experience with demonetization and difficult to implement GST, they're in trouble, they need help. And a large number of people who wandered around the countryside worked in these small places. Now, in order to try and help them, the government came up with a package. They call it a stimulus. The number given is 20 lakhs, 10% of GDP. But that number has been debunked in the overall press and the profession for several reasons. One is about 40% of it comes from the Reserve Bank. It's the realm of monetary policy, not fiscal policy, and doesn't really come as stimulus from the government. The rest of the package is also in the form of refinancing and insurance schemes. For example, for MSMEs, there is a fund that has been set aside. I think it's 50,000 crores. But it is to implement it through agencies like NABARD and SIDBI. Now, some small enterprises were telling me the other day that they can't really take these loans at all because SIDBI says, okay, the interest rate is low, we'll give you the loan, but we want it repaid in 90 days. Now, at this kind of situation, in this point of time, nobody has the confidence that they can roll over the money and repay in 90 days. And I think the offtake on these has been very low. And this is the case with many of the other things. However, there are welcome parts of it. The allocations for the employment guarantee scheme have been increased. And when laborers go back to their home states, this may give them something of a fallback. The wages under it have been increased to just over 200. So 200 per day for 100 days, it gives them some sustenance. Whether it is enough, time will tell. However, my own thinking is that while this is mitigation of distress, there is no long-term solution. Other things have to be done. The current nature of the economic crisis is twin shocks. There's a supply shock with the breakdown of chains, production not taking place. So there's a problem on that side. I think it was this that some of the RBI measures, lower interest rates, were supposed to address. But the point is that if they see no possibility of selling their goods, people are not going to get into production. The second side is the complete demand shock, where the normal activities of people, income drying up in their hands, except for basic essentials, people are not spending money. What are the ways out of this? I see no option to an income transfer. I won't even use the word stimulus. I think it's income support. Yes, there are problems of wrong targeting, undeserving people getting it and so on. But at a time of distress like this, I think it is important that whoever comes be given a certain sum. It has to be decided, 2,000, 3,000, whatever. Abhijit Banerjee suggested 1,000 rupees to anyone who comes with a temporary ID allocated. That could be the Aadhaar number if they have it. If they don't, you take their biometrics and allot an Aadhaar number. But at this time of distress, just give money to people so that at least some minimum distress is reduced and some expenditure takes place. However, the spending that takes place by this class of people will be on essentials. You know, foodstuffs, maybe some clothing, cooking gas, oil, things of this sort. It will not help industry. Industry depends on, industrial production depends on a higher level of income. The confidence is now there just now. The other thing that has happened post 91 reforms has been a great increase in inequalities in society. You all know the analysis by Piketty, but there's also the analysis that Piketty and Abhijit Banerjee have done of India. And they have looked at an interesting source of data, which is income tax returns. The Indian Income Tax Department was set up in 1922, and there have been the tax returns and the data on tax returns anonymized without giving data of what I pay, for example, has been made available. And using this data, Banerjee Piketty found that in India, from 1922 to about independence, there was some increase in inequality. From independence up to about 1980, there was a reduction in inequality. And from 1980 to 2000, which was the date of their paper, there was once again an increase in inequality to the levels of 1922. Now, what happened after 2000, we don't know, because Income Tax Department, I think, got alarmed at these findings, and they stopped collecting and releasing income tax returns. Now, this brings us to another problem that we face as economists and statisticians, is that data like that was available for a long period is no longer available now. And we are all aware of the problems of other data, recent debates on GDP calculations, NSS. So we can't say with confidence exactly what is happening. We can observe trends, but the official numbers are missing. I would submit that if you are going forward in any given way, it will be absolutely essential that we come out with approach papers. The National Accounts Division used to publish something called Sources and Methods. Now, these kind of things enable anyone to look at it and calculate for themselves. There's an openness and there's a reliability in the data. Unfortunately, that has been lost. So the impact of inequality on the current situation is that the income support given to poor people will help them but it may help local industry, it may help kirana shops, it may help agro industry and so on. But it is unlikely to lead towards an improved demand for the organized sector of industry. That is a fairly big problem. The tax concessions that were given by the government, I think last September or October, have reduced revenues by about over 2 lakh crores. It's a large amount of money. But will it result in greater investments? Now, I'm not sure that tax rates are the major factor on which investment decisions depend. If you're in a situation of a huge demand slowdown, I'm not sure why anybody will invest in a situation. The so-called animal spirits will be missing. So I don't think tax returns are likely to make a difference. There's a loss of revenue. And this is the last point I think I want to make. If income support of this magnitude is to be given, where will the funds come from? A lot has been discussed on this. The first point I wish to make is that this is not a time to talk about fiscal discipline. I think the FRBM Act has more often been observed in the breach than in spirit. So even in normal times, we have not paid much attention to it. In an extraordinarily difficult time, we shouldn't even worry about it. There are two views when it comes to this. One is that government can borrow, but if it borrows now, then our children and grandchildren have to repay it. This is basically an accounting logic. Is the government account something like my household account? Mikoba's equation says that income 20 pounds, expenditure 19.5, happiness. Income 20 pounds, expenditure 20 pounds and 50 shillings, 50 pence, unhappiness. On this logic, yes, there is a bit of a problem. But government is not. Government is sovereign. Government has the power to create money. Government has the power to set interest rates. And there is no great difficulty for the government to tell the Reserve Bank to buy bonds that it issues and to finance its expenditures through this route. The catch here is that if it is irresponsible in doing so, we'll have runaway inflation. But so long as it is used to support productive activities and ensure that there is a multiplier effect, I do not see much of a risk in monetizing this deficit and spending the money now. Okay, if we want to summarize some of these points, was a lockdown essential? Yes, I think a lockdown was essential. The rate of infection and things were such that I don't think there were, as far as I know, 2 countries that did not lock down, Sweden and Japan. Yes, they managed to contain COVID, but both countries had an astonishingly good health system. Both countries had population that obeyed government directions, a long history of discipline and social responsibility. I'm not sure that we can borrow that particular model. But was a total lockdown necessary? I think that is a debatable point. Even China only locked down Wuhan. Italy locked down Lombardy. In our case, it's the urban centers. We should have begun by closing the airports and then the urban centers. When it started, there was not much threat to the rural areas. If I look at the Karnataka data, there are about 20 districts that did not report a case during the lockdown. So the question is, could we have had a limited lockdown and let economic activity continue elsewhere? Secondly, was a lockdown with 4 hours notice the right thing to do? Looking back on what happened with poor laborers, I think it would have been good if we had given them a week's notice. After all, there were only 200 cases and a chance to go home. Well, it's too late to talk about that now. It's over. But during the lockdown, we have also had certain unhappy experiences. For example, when the lockdown was being released, in Karnataka, for example, the chief minister met the builders and decided to stop the Shramak trains. And a clear example of lobbying and the interest of one section dominating over the other. But it was also clear migrants, us and them, we are builders, we are rich, they are helpless, and we need them as soon as this is over, so stop it. Now, I don't know how to develop this particular point. I've already said government knew about the internal migration and people working out of state and in faraway places. Was it because they realized that after lockdown, these people are needed in the recovery and it was a calculated decision? Or was it something that we haven't forgot, that in the panic of decision making, after all, the high risk category are the older people and the decision makers are older people. The Prime Minister is a senior citizen, secretaries to government are near senior citizens. And was it just a panic reaction? I'm not attributing any blame and motive, but it is in our interest that we have unconscious biases. And therefore, this could happen. It's difficult to say. And finally, I want to end with this. This is a rather ironic kind of a point. These poor laborers for 2 months have been in very desperate situation. Social distancing doesn't mean where they are. Locked up 5 or 6 to a room. They've been in huts, they've been in the open air. They've been in close proximity to each other. They've been in the open. What is astonishing is that with millions on the move, the rates of infection among the poor laborers seem to be rather low. Yes, they've gone on trains and when they reach their destination, there is some infection, maybe they were asymptomatic and some cases are now shooting up in Bihar and UP and so on. But the point is that it's interesting to note that among the laborers themselves, there are millions of them, infection rates are low. Is this the beginnings of herd immunity? We have not treated them well, but are they returning that compliment by helping the country develop herd immunity? I do not know. Is immunity a binary where either you are immune or you're not immune? Why is it that infection rates in India seem to be lower than in some other countries? That when infected, the fever is mild to moderate, particularly in the younger age groups. Why is it that the death rates in India are lower than in other countries? So with all these puzzles that have been thrown up now, we did not know this at the time of lockdown. It could be that there is some immunity already. There was some data which said that countries that had malaria tend to have developed some kind of immunity to COVID as well. I do not know, I'm not a doctor. But is it possible that we don't have a situation where one is completely immune and completely susceptible? Or is there a middle range with varying degrees of immunity and susceptibility? Is it possible that these poor laborers had some kind of higher levels of immunity which explains this? And what's the implication for the future from this? I think I'll stop at this point and hand it back to Arun.
Rajiv, how many questions have come in?
No, sir, there are no questions. But what we can do is we can always ask them, ask the participants, sir.
Yeah. Vinod, probably you can also talk about the way out now. Now we are at this point of time in a flux, let us say. So how can the economy be brought back to what it was earlier? What kind of interventions from the government are required is it has to be sector wise? Do you choose the sectors, or do we use certain parts of the state to kickstart the regrowth? Do you have any views on that? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sir, mute.
No, now it's okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Yes, sir.
I don't think any of us has an answer to this, but it might be worth thinking aloud and talking together about it.
Yeah.
We can start with the nature of the lockdown. It was completely top down. I don't know why it is that it was the Home Ministry that was in charge of the lockdown. The Home Ministry is obsessed with security, controls the police, and everything is, you broke the law, I'm going to deal with you. And to a large extent, there was this punitive element where somebody seen outside was yelled at by the police. Why is it that the Health Ministry was not in charge of this? I'm puzzled by this because there is some reason why there's a ministry completely devoted to a subject. So I would first say that we should now in future look at initiatives from the Home Ministry. The second thing is, I'm not sure that a central diktat from Delhi is the way to go in future. I have no comment on the past, it's over. But we've had a lot of experience looking at central schemes and the one-size-fits-all approach of central schemes, which had led to a lot of money being unspent, targets not being met, etc. So as a federal country, as a country that is a union of states, I'd say the first thing to do is to recognize the difference. The issues of labor, the issues of health, issues of small industry are all in the domain of the states. And I think they should be allowed to form policies and strategies appropriate to themselves. And if you look at what has happened, the positives have come from the states. Several states have done well. Kerala has done well. Odisha has done well. Karnataka has not done badly. Rajasthan has been making good effort. So if that is the case, that states are doing well, what we need is coordination from the level of the government of India. We need information, we need research, we need transmission of international experiences. We need the release of funds. This has been the biggest failure so far. Even legitimate GST dues have not been given to the states. And when the relief package was announced, why was it channeled through SIDBI and NABARD? Why couldn't it have been given to the states? Even a 1% of GDP transferred directly to the states using the Finance Commission formula, I think would have meant a better use of money. Now, this is one way, it's in terms of the method, and the logic that I'm giving for the center-state relations applies also for state-municipal kind of relationships. State also should make its policy and leave a lot of implementation to local governments, particularly elected governments. A local government should not mean the chief executive officer of Zilla Parishad. There is an elected Zilla Pradhan, and they have to have some responsibility in this matter. So this is one side of it. I see one question here which is talking about labor reform. Now, several states have passed laws withdrawing certain protections that existed earlier. Labor reform is a difficult question because a lot of the laws that existed are not good either for the company or for the laborer. There was a lot of research which showed that it gave the wrong incentives to companies. A lot of research which has shown that workers have been unable to actually get hold of the benefits they wanted. So it's a system that is clearly in need of reform. But there's a difference between reform for the better and just simple reform. I think abolishing of the laws is no answer, and no less than Azim Premji has said so. A part of the problem is the way we look at the issue. why is it that labor reform or labor laws apply to what is called the organized sector? Why doesn't it apply to workers? Any worker should be protected by the law. If there's a law to protect workers in the workplace, those protections should apply to all workers. We have created a system in which there's a class of labor that is relatively privileged, which gets protections of various sorts, and 90% of the workforce which has nothing at all. I think this is something that we have to change, and we have to change this by a different approach where protections go to all who work. Not an easy thing. It requires a lot of discussion. It requires a lot of brainstorming with lawyers, with labor experts, unions. So that is one side of the labor reform issue.
Sir, there are a couple of questions. I'll just read it out
please.
for you, sir.
Yeah, please do.
And the first one is by Ms. Jyotsna Jaha. She
Yes.
says, how about the package? Measures other than monetary policy, how will you rate those?
Well, yeah, I've already excluded 40% of the announced package, which comes from the Reserve Bank. Of the 60%, I have serious problems with an approach which says that we depend on companies to respond. We are giving you incentive to invest. We are giving you security to borrow. You can borrow loans. And then you act surprised when that is not happening. I don't see anybody who will borrow anything, even at very, very low rates of interest, when demand is completely collapsed. So we have a situation where the government has announced huge amounts of money in the form of reforms, but I think none of these can actually be taken up. What is needed is a direct transfer. To small MSMEs, you give a direct transfer in the form of a wage subsidy to start with. It shouldn't go to employers, it should go to employees. All those who are working in the, now in many cases, there are informal contracts, there are problems of implementation. But there is also a lot of research which shows that when tax benefits and things are given to companies, they're not passed on to consumers and workers. We have to find a way around that. I mean, that's not a full answer, but can I go to the next question?
Yes, sir. The next question is by Mr. Arun Kumar, which states that what way the government policy will orient to reach out to the unorganized segment, the country must debate.
I agree, the country must debate. I've already said a few things about this. I don't have a solution. We must debate it and collectively come up with an answer.
The next question is, sir, do you think that on the ground, whether bank branches would lend unsecured loans in a manner the government wants? Is there any role of private sector banks because PSBs are directed to lend?
The PSBs are not lending. I don't think it's a question of this. Banks will lend for productive purposes. If people cannot see any productive activity they can do, and in a reasonable economic cycle, they will not borrow. So we are in what is called a liquidity trap. There's a lot of liquidity in the banks, but nobody wants to borrow because the outlook is uncertain.
The next question is, sir, the most state governments are severely short of revenue. What would be the way forward, sir?
Transfers from the center. I think it's incumbent on the center to transfer money. It's also incumbent on the center to permit states to function and get rid of central agencies that implement it. So, and deficit financing is the way to go. There's no other answer.
Another interesting question is, how can the government of India make rules to make the entire CSR money got into PM's CARES fund while denying any kind of accountability?
I think it's completely wrong. First, I'm not convinced about CSR. Companies are there to make a profit for their shareholders. And this CSR, voluntarily, they can do what they like. I don't like the idea of this legalized CSR. And I don't see any reason for giving tax benefits and things like that on this matter. Why can't the Chief Minister's Relief Fund be included in the tax benefit for CSR? I think it's completely wrong.
There's Mr. Subhash Tandon from Delhi, sir. My point is how to win the confidence of the migrant laborers that they are wanted for nation building. Their interest would be taken care of.
I don't like the word migrant laborers. That shows an us and them thing. They're us, they're citizens of this country. And I think we have to apologize for the bad behavior, whether of the government or of their employers. We have data which says that in Bangalore, for example, people working in many real estate projects were not paid for January and February when they paid work for half a month, but 2.5 months wages were not given. Now, this kind of irresponsible behavior is totally unacceptable. I don't know if government can penalize it, but the best way to do this is to penalize it and prosecute some of those guilty of it. That will give some confidence. See, these are not pliable instruments. They're human beings. They're citizens of India. We should start by treating them as citizens of India.
Another question is, I think, second last question. The scale of livelihoods lost is immense.
Yes.
How will this be handled? Education, schools and colleges have been totally locked down. What will happen post-COVID?
You know, this is interesting in the sense that post-COVID, can we go back to business as usual? My feeling is we cannot. We've had a model which is called the supply side economics, in which we have depended on private enterprise, and private enterprise has given us growth, it has given us inequality, it has given us exclusion. Because the logic is you pay for what you want, you don't have the money, you don't come into the system. Now, what has happened as a result of this? Earlier, what used to be called public goods have been privatized. Health was a quintessential public good, but we have cases, the newspaper reports of private hospitals built on concessional land given by governments refusing to treat COVID patients. Well, profit maximizing behavior is profit maximizing. We have no comment on that. But I think that a model in which everything is dependent on the private sector is not a valid one. I don't think a government that depends on the private sector and is friendly to the private sector, like the way the release of funds has shown, is an answer. I'm deeply worried by the fact that during this time, a whole lot of laws have been changed through the ordinance route. The abolition of labor protection through ordinances at the state level, for example. The other thing is that there are reports in the newspapers of a large number of projects being approved, waiving environmental clearance, power projects on the Ganga, on elsewhere. So this is a clear gray rhino thing. We know there is a risk and we are ignoring it. So I don't think this is going to work. We need a totally different approach. Call it Gandhian if you like, but we have to talk in terms of one where we have to meet the needs of everybody, not the greed of some. And therefore, return to the past with past levels of consumption is not going to work. I mean, look at the irony of the current situation where the states are opening liquor shops because that is one source of revenue. They can get the excise on it. So after GST, they have only excise on fuel and liquor. And they jacked up the tax on petrol. When world petroleum prices are falling, we are paying extra because that's the only source of revenue that both states and center have. Liquor shops are being opened, liquor taxes have been increased. And you have protests from a lot of women's groups all over saying that during the 2 months of lockdown, our men have not had drink, they managed somehow to survive. Why are you rehabituating them to liquor, to opening liquor shops? I mean, we cannot do what we did before. We have to collectively think of different ways of doing it. And we have to start with local issues, supporting local and not the big enterprises and resource training industry.
There are a lot of questions, sir, but I'll just take the few important ones. Okay. One question which states to is, what about the centralization approach of union government in this case? The states Okay, the states which have a multi-level governance structure seem to be better understand the situation. Typical cases, Kerala, Tamil Nadu. What can the other states government can learn from them?
Karnataka, Odisha as well, Rajasthan to some extent, where local governments have played a role. I agree with this. I think you have to give local governments their due.
Okay, the last question, ladies and gentlemen, I'll just take with talks of encouraging local production for local consumption. Are we looking at a more closed economy? What happens to our celebrated sectors like IT in these contests?
I don't think the IT sector is in it. I mean, it had an external market. It should continue to have it to the extent that market, the demand sustains. But we have to do something. For example, the centralized public distribution system for food. Why should it be limited to rice and wheat? Why can't there be local procurement? Buy the ragi that is grown locally in Bangalore and the Bangalore region. Give people ragi which they eat. In fact, I find it a paradox that the things we subsidize in the public distribution system, rice, wheat, and sugar, are bad for health. It's been documented. And instead of calling it a food subsidy, you can make a case that it is a diabetes subsidy. We should provide in the public distribution system foods that are happy, locally grown, locally procured. Why should it be centralized?
Sir, any point from Mr. Arun, sir, or shall we start the proceedings?
Rajiv, there were a couple of people who were raising their hands.
Okay, I am unable. So they can always come one by one and interact directly with Dr. Vyaslu, sir.
Probably we have some more time in hand. Probably.
Okay, fine, good enough, sir. So what I will. Okay, fine, sir. The thing is, I think state governments, local governments, and sponsors, the guest workers, should have kept them avoided. He's talking about the migrant laborers. Avoided exodus like return travels. That would have avoided the spread. What we see now, what's your guideline for monitoring of guest workers for our national policy, sir?
I think first we have to treat them as citizens, not guest workers. They're no different from you and me. It's a mindset, and that is important. Second, I think we have to get rid of this thing that they can be paid exploitative wages. You look at any of our apartments, we all have contracts with agencies and pay a certain amount to the agency per guard. But what do the guards get? I think these are the things that we have to change. They have to be given decent conditions. I don't see any option but for wages to increase. Wages at the lower level. I'm not very worried about Mukesh Ambani's salary, but at the lower level, we've got to give reasonable wages. Minimum wages, for example, should not be less than what is set in the NREGA. In addition to that, we have to make sure that social security works. ESI is limited to one class of people. I think health has to be provided to anyone who asks for it. It happens in Kerala and they've got a good record. And incidentally, I call this a grey rhino because we've known about health. There have been a number of pandemics. There's been SARS, MERS, Ebola, Nipah, Zika. A whole lot of these have come. So we know that health pandemics will come. But our investment in health has been niggardly. It's only in recent years it's reached 1% of GDP. And a lot of it is limited to salaries of staff. So I think that it has to be done, and health has to be in the public sector. You can have a few private hospitals outside of that system. But health is not an industry in which you should talk of profit. It's a welfare issue, a utility. And therefore, we need a national health system of the type they have in Europe. There are ways of doing it. Germany has an interesting way of avoiding layoffs. What they do is that when demand falls and there is a need for less labor, the existing workers work shorter hours, everybody stays on the job. And if they work for 50% of the time, company pays 50%, and the government puts in 30% so that everybody gets 80%. In other words, the workers bear some cost for the slowdown. The government makes it up. So burden is shared. And I think one of the essential things now is that banks and industries have to accept a haircut.
So there are two questions which are interrelated. First one is, could you comment on the focus on import substitution, while at the same time the aim to manufacture for the world? Are these two compatible? And simultaneously, what is your view on go for local? Does it mean make in India, even if they are foreign brands, or buy local only?
See, it's very confusing. How is this different from the self-reliance we had under Indira Gandhi? To me, it seems very, very similar. It's a patriotic slogan. It is something. We need much greater clarity in this. We should produce what we are good at, and we should import what we are not good at. Self-reliance to me means that you're productive enough to have the money to import what you need. Not that we should produce everything from shoes to atom bombs. So I'm a little confused about this Atmanirbhar. So that's one side of it. We have to be more rational in the economic policies.
A question which has come is it a good idea to fire the employees at mid-level, their family in shambles, and leave their family in shambles? Why can't leadership be compassionate, collaborative, and concerned to the employees? Shahbaz Tando.
I think it's a good point. Well, capitalists by nature are not compassionate. Individuals may be. Individuals may be, but the system, companies geared to make profits, it will make profits. And companies geared to make profits where they employ chartered accountants to find loopholes around a law that they don't like. This is the reality. So and anyway, since we are talking about this, I would say that one thing is to reverse the tax cuts. We should have a very different system of taxation. We should have a much more progressive system of taxation. I don't see why 30% should be the top rate. And it should go up very much. I'm not saying 95% as in Indira Gandhi's time, but something very much more than that. The average tax rate in the European countries is 45%. I also, apart from higher levels of tax, I don't see why there should be preferential treatment that is given to capital gains. Capital gains should be treated as any other kind of income. These are the distortions in our economy that should be corrected.
So the last two questions are, COVID is a good wake-up call. What about disruptions like solar storms, loss of power grids? Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sir, redundancies in the internet cable networks, are we prepared for worst crisis?
I don't think we are prepared for any crisis. There are states that are prepared in local agencies. If there's any amount of data in the Tehri area that earthquakes are imminent, we are building new dams. So there is a warning signal. It's a question of the kind of decision societies take. Are you going to say that growth is important even if in 2 generations we can't breathe? After all, look at what the lockdown has shown us. The air even in places like Delhi has cleared up. I believe you could actually see a blue sky. And it shows that a very short period of time, nature has begun a process of self-healing. Are we prepared to go back? If what I've read in the newspapers about the clearances given, for example, in Karnataka along the Western Ghats, or in the Tehri area of the Himalayan foothills, is true, then yes, you will get growth, but you will also get new incidents of this sort that you have to deal with. The problem is that the profit is private and the costs are public. So when something like this happens, you and I pick up the tab, but nothing happens. You look at the 2008 crisis, it threw the world into a tailspin, but the bankers got bonuses.
The next question is, will the moratorium being intervened by Apex Court be inimical the banking sector?
I don't know. The court is a totally independent agency and it will take its decisions which are binding on all of us. I'm
No,
disappointed at some decisions. I'm disappointed that it did not take into account this question of laborers moving until senior lawyers wrote a stinging letter to the court. And these are, by the way, we have to go by what the court does. And that's outside our hands. But it's also unfortunate if we keep going to the court, because that reflects an executive failure. I think it's up to the executive to how to deal with COVID is basically an administrative government matter. It's not a legal matter. So,
the last question is, sir, the artist community has been completely left out of any measure or incentive. Given our pride about our culture, what can be done to keep our artists motivated?
I don't know about all artists, but I know that musicians have been doing a great deal to perk up our spirits. If you look at, now the famous web, the Facebook Live and all of this, have been performing, cheering us up during lockdown. And all this for no payment. I mean, musicians should be paid like everybody else, but they have risen to the occasion. So let's hope that art will thrive. As somebody said, the arts have nothing to do with the defense of the country, but they make the country worth defending.
The last one is just cropped up. Yesterday was World Environment Day. The Global Environment Outlook Report 2019, bracket GEO6 by the UN Environment Program had mentioned that we can see more human health risks if urgent action is not taken to protect the environment. Do you see business and organization taking sustainability and the need for sustainable measures more seriously?
Well, if businesses take it, but let me talk about large businesses that can afford it, not roadside repair shops. Oh, why do they treat pollution control as a cost? I mean, if pollution control is built into the overall cost of the project and your cost benefit analysis is conducted that way, why are wages treated as a cost and not an input? So there's a lot of things that we have to do in terms of our thinking. I think protecting the environment should be something that is treated as, after all, production, you produce coal, but you produce pollution at the same time. It's a joint product. So can we not think of a system of accounting in which the value of the coal minus the value of whatever it takes to clear up the pollution is seen as the net benefit, and we take our decisions on that basis?
So the last is, which just cropped up, the LG tragedy is also a blot on our nation.
What tragedy?
The LG tragedy, that plant which had
oh, yes.
environment in Kerala. Yes, sir.
Yes.
We learned nothing from Bhopal. What are your views on this?
No, that is true. We have learned. And this is what makes me a little pessimistic. So many things have happened. Why haven't we learned? Well, it's not true we haven't learned. If you look at how Odisha dealt with the cyclone, they've learned. They've taken steps. It's a quiet state. We call it Bimaru. We do all that. But they've done a good job. They've even controlled COVID. It doesn't get publicity like Kerala. No, so there are states that are learning. I think the government of India is learning proof.
How can the tourism industry survive after pandemic? Millions of people survive on tourism sector have lost jobs. What kind of schemes are required?
I think we have to do survival of the fittest. I mean, it will come back in due course of time, and I hope they have alternative occupations. But I don't really know the answer to that. With social distancing and all that, who will go to Goa on holiday now?
Yeah, very true, sir. Thank you very, very much, sir. Now, shall we proceed for the last segment of our webinar, sir? Arun, sir?
Yes, please.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Brigadier Rajiv Kapoor, the Regional Director for IOD Bangalore. I deem it, on behalf of Institution of Directors India, I deem it a great honor to propose a vote of thanks to our honorable guest, Dr. Vinod Vyaslu, and extend our sense of appreciation for his inspiring and thought-provoking address on economic impact of lockdown, thus making this webinar meaningful. Dr. Vinod Vyaslu covered the subject from its inception and apprised us with respect to GDP of 3% in the pre-independence era, and then subsequently increasing it to 6%, which is the low as on date. That is the minimum which we are supposed to be, having. He very diligently brought out external and internal measures adopted by government, and thus bringing out the highs and lows. We are thankful to you, sir, enriching us with this information. And today in this webinar, ladies and gentlemen, there were more than 80 people, esteemed listeners, and I am hopeful that each and every one of us have been enriched by this talk. I would like to thank each and every one of you for your involvement and willingness that was expressed by means of discussion in the form of questions and very diligently being answered and patiently being answered by Dr. Vinod Vyas. I would like to thank Mr. Arun Balakrishnan for spearheading this event, and also the entire team of IOD India for their contribution and presence, including those handling the technical side, thereby making the webinar successful. In the end, I would like to bring to your notice that our next global webinar has been scheduled for 9th of June, basically on board's roles and strategy, overseeing risk, uncertainties, and COVID-19. We would request all of you to be part of it and kindly attend. Thank you and Jai Hind.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Vinod. Thanks.
Thank you.